Um, so I'm really pleased to have Dan Gibson here with us today. I first heard of Dan Gibson a number of years ago from Jay Smith. Jay Smith is often referred to your work in relation to Mecca and Petra. I've seen your documentary Sacred City, and I've also read one of your books, The Early Islamic Qiblas. And I particularly found the section on further evidence very interesting in terms of all your supporting evidence for the position on Petra. Um, so I think one of the things I'd like to say straight off is I noticed Patricia Crona and yourself came to similar conclusions. And I've often wondered which of you came to that conclusion first. Was it just a kind of synchronicity, or what would it be there?
I think Patricia Crona came to the conclusion that it was in northern Arabia. She wasn't alone. There were several others, I think Michael Cook as well, and others who were looking at northern Arabia. And that's what I first heard about this whole thing was actually from a someone on the Muslim Free Thinkers website who contacted me and said, "Can I use a photo from your website?" I was putting up pictures about Petra and the Nabateans,
Yeah,
and he asked for the photo, and then I found out he thought that Islam began in northern Arabia or
oh
southern
wow,
Jordan somewhere, and he wanted a photo, and that's when I first heard about the theory. I thought it was just a wild theory that was
yeah,
out there, one of those conspiracy theories, and I didn't
yeah,
take it very seriously.
yeah. So it's actually just one of those random things, and that's kind of made a huge difference in terms of your paths in your work of the last number of years.
Yeah, yeah. For me, I just stumbled across it, thought it might be a fascinating idea, tucked it in the back of my mind. Wasn't until a couple of years later I was teaching in a college in Europe, and I had the afternoons free. I went there without a bunch of extra work, and suddenly realized I've got a couple hours every afternoon where I'm just sitting around. So I went to the library, and I found the book Sirat Rasulullah, the life of Muhammad.
Yeah,
And I sat down and I thought, I'm going to read this with a Northern Arabian mind. Mind you, I had spent by that time almost 20 years in the Middle East, or maybe even more than that. And I was very familiar with the deserts and with the
yeah,
geography and the archaeology. And so
yeah,
I went through that book thinking Northern Arabia. And as I got through the book, I realized there's something to this. It fits. The whole Northern Arabia thing fits the directions the armies move and where the different geographical locations were. So that really caught my attention. But I realized it's going to be a huge study. I need to, if I'm going to do this, and I wasn't convinced I was going to look into it. I thought if
yeah,
I'm going to do this, I need to put everything aside and would need a year or 2 years just to concentrate on this study because I would need to read everything and from
yeah,
every
yeah,
angle and try, because if
yeah,
there's one good argument against me, it will defeat the whole thing. And so
yeah.
I wasn't prepared for that to happen.
You don't egg in your face kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right.
Um,
I mean,
w-
it's a frightening thing to write a new
yeah,
reconstruction of history because you have to answer everybody's arguments, and I needed to do that up front. This wasn't something that just an idea came to me, and I have guys write to me and say, "Oh,
yeah,
I've got this idea. It just came to me," and
yeah,
it's like, well, if it just came to you, write me in a couple of years after you've bashed it around for a while,
yeah.
because I'm not here to try to knock down everybody else's ideas they just got. They should do that themselves.
Yeah, you have to do the groundwork. Um, and of course, in the community, you have got sort of really conservatives within the scholarly community, and then you have like kind of free thinkers who are trying to push the envelope and try and come up with new ideas and try and see if it fits, you know.
There are all kinds of people with all kinds of angles and thoughts on Islam and on the beginning of Islam. Frank Donor, I think it is, wrote an article a while ago on four approaches to Islam. I'm thinking of maybe doing a video and expanding that to five or six because as I read through his approaches, I realized I don't fit in any of these. So
Yeah,
there's at
yeah,
least another approach, and there might be several more. So I disagree with different people. We use each other's data. The important thing is to find the data that other people have and see how do you fit the scenario. I look at the scenario
yeah.
differently, and but the data is the one that it all stands on.
I think one of the things I think we both kind of share on is the idea that Muhammad is a real historical figure rather than just a fictional
Right.
person.
Yeah, and because a lot of people out there think he's just was fictional, made up, and they're taking the data I have and saying, this, and they think it supports their theory. Well, actually, it doesn't support either side. It just puts Muhammad in a different location, but it doesn't change the fact that he's actually was a real historical person.
Yeah.
He's mentioned in history. It's pretty hard to argue that he didn't exist.
Yeah, I want to just refer you to this book, which I don't think you've read. It's Andrew Bannister's book. It's called An Oral Formulaic Study of the Quran, and he makes the case.
I had an interesting opportunity about a year ago, I think maybe a year and a half ago, to meet him.
Really, yeah,
Yeah, he found out that he was going to be in the same town that I was in, and he
yeah.
contacted me, and I said, "Why don't you come over?" And we sat down for a couple of hours and bashed some things around. That was a fun and interesting visit. Sometimes you wish, I wish I'd recorded that, but anyway.
So you actually did meet him, did you?
I have sat down in the same room. We had a couple hours together.
Okay, so you will have heard of his thesis on.
Yes, I have
Yeah,
not gone through it in detail.
what I found interesting about it is the idea that Muhammad could have quite easily have produced his surahs if he was steeped in the poetic history and tradition of learning formulas and being able to construct them into a kind of a poetic meter, just off the cuff. And he came up, or he introduced me through the book at least to the oral literary theory, which is the idea that if you find formulas of 20% or higher, it's a very strong argument for it being orally created. And when he analysed the Quran, it was, I think, an average of 50 something percent overall, whereas some
Yeah.
surahs were really high, and then some surahs were zero, which would suggest that they were based on a literary source. So even though
I
it's
would
not
be.
100%, it's still quite persuasive.
Is that all in the book? That information on which
Yeah,
stores are which? I will be
yeah,
the next one to buy it.
yeah. It's
Simply because
fascinating.
I'm working on another theory, but and it's a little different from his.
Yeah.
Because I'm always researching every day, spending 10, 12 hours driving my family crazy, doing my
Well,
research.
well, the
But
tables
let
in
me
this
show.
are. Sorry, I was just going to say, in terms of the data in this, it's just incredible. For someone like yourself, you're going to eat your heart out with the sort of information, the detailed information. A lot of it was maybe too much for a layman like myself, but I think you'll find it interesting at least.
I will find it very interesting. Just to go back to the orality, when we lived out with Bedouin, we spent almost 4 years out living in a rural setting with Bedouin all around us and out in the country, and we visited a lot with Bedouin and sat with them. I discovered every village has one or two or three wannabe poets.
Yeah,
Poets are very held in very high esteem, and some of them were actually very good poets. And so there are people trying to write poetry all of the time.
yeah,
uh, Poetry is the art form for the Arabs, and it was all the way back. It's a big deal when somebody has proven themselves and they are a poet, and a poet has emerged in the tribe, and the tribe takes great honor in having this poet. And even the king of Jordan, I remember back when he would every year the poets would come and they would write poetry all year, and they would come and recite this poetry, and he would give them all big gifts. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
because it's we in the West don't appreciate how much this using rhyme and meter and rhythm and everything is so important to them, and especially to the Bedouin. And they weren't writing these things down. They
yeah.
are uh, they're memorizing it. And so even when we were shooting the film, The Sacred City, we had lots of people come up to us and said, I'd like to recite poetry.
Wow.
And I remember we sat down just because, we were there and we were in between stuff. I said, okay, let's record some of these guys, just because we were waiting on somebody. Once we were waiting for a horse handler to show up to take a picture of to bring the horse and everything else. So we sat these guys down, and as one guy was giving us poetry, I realized, hey, that's 1,001 Nights. He's reciting it in Arabic, and the
Wow.
next one comes, and it's a very ancient poem that predates Islam, and he's got it all up in his head.
It's
And so
incredible.
these guys have got this poetry, and they love to give it. So it's fascinating to sit and listen
Yeah.
to the poets, and I have no problem with the Quran was given in the form of poetry, and that's as far as I can see, they are each individual poems that
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
in the Quran,
And actually,
and they
it
stood
just means
alone.
it's easier to remember, obviously, and keep the Quran before it was properly written down.
If you go back to John of Damascus, he when he refers to the Quran, never calls it the Quran. He only has the names of the individual poems.
Oh
So
yeah,
he
yeah,
talks about al-Baqarah, the cow, or the
yeah,
heifer. That's the he names that by name because he knows it as a standalone, not as
yeah.
part of a bigger book.
Yeah, when I read that actually, I was confused by that. I was saying, what, Muhammad has written other books, and then I realized no, they're the surahs.
That's right.
Yeah. One of the things I found interesting in Andrew Bannister's analysis is he compares the Adam and Iblis story in the Quran, and what I wasn't aware of is there's 7 versions of it in the Quran,
Every
and
every story seems to have 2 or 3 versions of it. So if you want to get a story, some people think I just got to go to the first chapter and I'll get the Adam
yeah,
and Eve story. But all of the stories are in multiple places.
yeah, yeah,
And Muhammad, or when he's giving this, he would say, and I'm just going through Job in the Quran, and it's in 4 or 5 different places. And he would
yeah,
say, and Job, and he would go on. He assumes you know the story,
yeah, yeah,
and then he talks about it. So he's not giving the story. There's an assumption you already know this, and he's
exactly, yeah,
referring to it, which would be why he would find Adam and Eve through multiple places.
yeah, yeah, and that's
Okay, go
part of.
ahead.
Oh, that's just part of performance variance. In retelling things multiple times, you're going to have slight variation, but there's going to be core of the story that will remain. But the
Right.
variants depend on the audience. Sometimes the audience want a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. So there's kind of different lengths to their renditions. One of the questions I suppose I should get into really is, can you talk us through how the Kaaba was moved from Petra to Mecca, the reasons, the when, the how, the why of all that, and what was the background, the political background,
Right.
please?
Now that's a big
That's
topic
it is, yeah, yeah,
because you need to understand what was happening at the time. Remember, after Muhammad, there was 4 rightly guided caliphs, but you get into the first civil war, and this is where the Sunnis and the Shias emerge from this war. It's the war over whether Ali should be the next caliph and whether it should follow Ali's line, or whether it should go through the community and who does the community elect. And so that was the difference between the Shias and the Sunnis becoming the majority of people who just elected the next caliph. Well, they elected some caliphs, and eventually they got to a caliph who decided that the capital of this new emerging empire should be Damascus because it's a world-class city. So Islam had taken over Damascus, and they moved in, and he said, this will be the new capital of the Islamic Empire. Well, that made some people upset because they figured Medina should be the capital or Mecca should be the capital. And so this second civil war began, and it's actually a bunch of little wars, but it all became one big giant war. And it's a man named Ibn Zubair, and he's in the Holy City, and he's in the middle of this war with Damascus. And during a lull in the war, he takes the Kaaba, that's that building that has the cloth around it, that square building, and he just knocks it all down, says it's not original, it's not where it is, and he puts the black rock, which is only about so big, he places it in a wooden stand with a piece of silk over it. And then he rebuilds that. Now, there's a long story. You might say, why did he knock it down? In the war, it was getting damaged. And so he takes this rock. The question is, where did he rebuild the Kaaba? And because
yeah,
we know it was all knocked down and it was all rebuilt. Interesting thing is, up to this point, every mosque is pointing at Petra. At
yeah,
this point, there seems to be a shift. And that's when I believe the rock was moved down to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. He still got it. He's taking the rock and he's moving it to a place of safety away from everybody else. And so the war is continuing. At the
so
very same time,
yeah,
there's other wars going on. This is not the only war.
yeah,
Okay, the main wars are going on as they're pushing against the Byzantines. They are pushing over against the east out to Afghanistan. They're pushing over into Spain and going up into France. So I mean, the Muslim armies are involved everywhere, and most of the attention is on the far reaches of Islam. So this battle that's happening back here is a religious battle. Remember,
Yeah.
most of the caliphs didn't go on pilgrimage. You don't find them recorded going on pilgrimage. You don't find them managing the religious things at all. That's up to religious leaders. They are civil rulers looking, these are Sunnis now, the Sunni civil rulers who are looking after all the civil things that are going on. And so they're involved in all of this. This is a new empire. They are using Arabic and Greek at this time. I mean, but all the records are being written in Greek, not in Arabic. They've got different people producing coins in different parts of the Islamic world. There's no standardized coin system. There's no standardized economic system. There's no standardized communication system. It's expanded so fast that they haven't built the infrastructure yet. So this war is going on. It's not the center of Islam. It's just one of the things that are going on.
This just in terms of the timeline, this would be around the 680s, would be around that time.
I turned off all my monitors here. So
not to worry. Well, I'm just let's say Abdul al-Malik. Abdul al-Malik. He started in 685.
Okay, let me point out. I've just pulled out Quranic geography. That's this book here. In the back, there's a timeline. It's multiple pages long, tells you what's happening every year, and both AH and AD. So it gives you some background to go. So when he wants me to look up something, I will pull out this timeline and check, because this is the backbone of what's happening.
Okay.
I only know the Islamic dates. I don't keep track.
Yeah, I know it's quite confusing between the two.
Well, no, the Islamic dates are very, very orderly. So the ones I find are a problem.
No problem.
So I mean, you have got the Byzantines are attacking in the year 69 to 70, but then you're right in the middle of the Second Civil War, and you've got all these other wars going on at the very same time. So the change in the war, I mean, okay. So it depends what you're looking at, because this is, I think, a 9-year war. So this thing goes on for a long time. You don't just find it in one place. I've got all the individual battles that are going on. So it starts out Ibn Zubair is disrupting the pilgrimage and so forth. And
I know he got killed in 692. That might help.
This is 683 now.
Okay.
The Kaaba is damaged.
Yeah.
If you're using Western dates, or 64 AH. Okay, the next year, Murad becomes the caliph in Damascus, and then there's the death of one caliph, and they begin to... So the caliphs are dropping left, right, and center. People are killing them, actually, and then another one gets, and so another group comes...
Unstable.
So Ibn Zubair, the next year, this is 685, says that he claims he found the original foundation stones of Abraham. He's going to rebuild the Kaaba. The question is, where did that happen? That same year, you look at the Azraqi revolt, you'll look at Kufa's rebelling, you've got revenges happening against the murder of Ali, and you've got al-Muqtar declares himself as the caliph in Kufa. So, I mean, this isn't one civil war. This stuff's all happening at once.
Wow.
The whole empire is breaking apart at this point. So it's just all having, all these problems are happening. So in 691, a big change happens. They bring in a guy called General Hajjaj. And he's in the book, he's in the videos, if you follow the YouTube videos. I mean, General Hajjaj is the key player. He is the guy who comes in. He is, there's a whole story about him, but he is sent around. He's a little short guy. They call him Al-Kalbi, the little dog, but not to his face. Because he goes around and he is, I mean, they beg him, when you attack the holy city, don't kill anybody in it because it's sacred ground. Well, he gets down, he's very frustrated. He asks the caliph, look, I've got to kill somebody. And then he sheds blood everywhere he goes. After this, he goes down to Medina and he sheds blood. He takes the companions of the prophets and he's killing them and persecuting them and, and everything because they disagree with him. And he becomes the big leader at this time, underneath the caliph. He's the guy who just he's merciless.
Is he anything to Abdul al-Malik, or is he working for Abdul al-Malik, who became caliph in 685 to 705?
And he marries Abdul Malik's daughter, I think, or does his? Oh, I have to go back and look. Does Abdul Malik's son marry this guy's daughter? Anyway, they're
Oh,
related
very
also in
closely
marriage
connected. Yeah,
very quickly along as well.
yeah. What
So
what big difference did Abdul al-Malik bring to the story of Islam? Because I know that he built the Dome of the Rock, and like, it seems like Islam suddenly came into public around
right.
his
Well, with
caliphate.
Abdul al-Malik, you remember we talked about these armies and the outposts. They've gone crossed the borders from Spain into France, been defeated, and they sort of have drawn a line there. They've
Yeah,
gone up, okay, to Constantinople, and that has sort of that battle is coming to an end. They have moved over past Afghanistan, now looking into India, and the army sort of end there. And so when he takes over everything, it's more or less the fighting on the outside is dwindling. And al-Hajjaj has gone around and put down all these revolts inside. He's just massacred people and done
yeah,
everything. He's got the empire back under control.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so along comes Marwan, and he wants to do something now. And so he's the first guy who makes Arabic the language of the
Okay,
empire. He
yeah.
he makes the first real coinage that belongs to the empire, not individual people, but actually the caliph and so forth. And so this is where you'll see coins coming out with the big M on them, and then with Muhammad's name and so
So
forth. The
they would no
Shahadi
longer have
first
the
appears on.
images.
Sorry.
They would no longer have the images that you would find on the
The
Byzantine coins.
That's right. Yeah. Now we're going to text only, no images.
Yeah, yeah,
He inherits if you're reading and interpreting history the way I do, he
yeah.
inherited the world when there are two qiblas. When we're looking at the archaeology, many mosques are pointing to Petra, and many mosques are pointing to Mecca. And along comes General Hajjaj, and he's now made the ruler of the eastern half of the empire. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
he is going to build his own city and his own mosque. And his mosque, he gets there and he has to decide, where's he going to aim his mosque?
Wow,
Is he
yeah,
going to aim his mosque at Petra, but the Black Rock isn't there? And he was the general who was there and smashed the place to pieces. Okay.
okay, yeah,
And so, I mean, and he tromped around in the holy city, killing people without regard for much religion. He really didn't want to point his mosque to that place full of pagan temples.
yeah,
But
yeah,
he had been fighting against the rebels, and he never managed to get down to Mecca and Saudi Arabia and get the Black Rock back. He just left it there, and because he was going around fighting all these other rebels. So the Black Rock is still in Saudi Arabia. He's not going to point his mosque there. So his mosque is called the Wasit Mosque. The word Wasit in Arabic means between. Okay,
okay,
and he
yeah,
points his mosque directly between Petra and Mecca. And
yeah,
so the town becomes known as Wasit and everything. And so he promotes this. Wherever they build mosques now, where he is in control, they point to the between position.
it
So
sounds.
if you use that tool, it's on the Sacred City website. Go to data and then look for the tool. You can examine all the mosques where they point in different years, and you see all
Yeah,
these between mosques. These all happened during the lifetime of General Hajjaj. As soon as he dies, that's the end of it.
wow,
And so when people argue against Marwan and say, he was a good caliph, he did all these wonderful, there's only one thing he did that was really bad, and that was letting Hajjaj line up the mosque in Wasit. Wasit is the one thing that everybody for the rest of millennial, of people through the next few thousand years are going to look back and say, he allowed the Qibla to be pointed in the between position. That's
yeah.
something he should never have done.
I
So
just
other
found it.
than that, he was a wonderful ruler. So when he builds the place in Jerusalem,
Yeah,
where is he going to focus that mosque? Is he going to focus it on Petra? Is he going to focus it on Mecca? Is he going to choose the between position? He
yeah,
builds a structure with no Qibla,
wow,
none whatsoever. And
yeah,
so it's a wonderful structure. But if you look beside it, there's another little version of the big one right beside it. It's
yeah,
called the Dome of the Chain, and it has a Qibla. Okay, and it points to Petra very clearly, but
Okay.
it's separate from the one because it's an earlier one that was there. It's different from the Dome of the Rock, which Murad builds.
I find it interesting that the general, who was a butcher, chose a very diplomatic solution to the problem with the two qiblas. I just thought it was quite ironic in a way.
He was a very clever man, Hajjaj. He
Yeah,
was a very
yeah,
clever man. He just didn't have the same regard for sacred things that many of the other Muslims of his time did.
yeah. It was a pragmatic approach.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and it had to be somebody had to go down with an iron fist and, bring the empire together, and it was his job. That's what he did.
yeah. So just moving on from that period, um, so the Abbasids overthrow the Umayyads in 750.
Yeah.
Um, what was leading to that? Like, what was behind all of that? Why were they so unhappy under the Umayyads, and what were they about? What was all that about?
That again is a
A big
long,
story.
long
The
story.
vanilla version, then.
It goes still, all of these things are tied together. It's not like
Yeah, yeah.
one war ends and the next one
No, no.
starts. So you get when Ibn Zubair was in the holy city, the people in Kufa join with him. At first they were against him, then they join together and they say to him, we are people who pray to the same Qibla as you do. So they've chosen the same Qibla, which was Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Okay, so they're the first ones after Ibn Zubair who have chosen that Qibla. So Kufa was also in rebellion against the people in Damascus. They did not like the whole thing that was happening in Damascus, which was a lot of intrigue, a lot of people killing one another and so forth. They wanted it different. So eventually the people in Iraq and in Kufa, they rise up in rebellion, but they need a leader who is related to the Prophet Muhammad. I mean,
Yeah,
just to make it legitimate, what their rebellion. I mean,
yeah.
Ibn Zubair was related back to the early guys, So they went back to Petra, back just south of Petra, 27 miles. There is the family of Abbas, the Abbas family, and that's where they went to find a member of the Abbas family, brought him over to Iraq, and said, "Now our rebellion is legitimate because we have got a member of the Abbas family, direct relation to Muhammad." And so that's where the word Abbasids come from.
Hmm.
That this now is the empire, the whole line that came out of the Abbas family. And so they then challenged the Umayyads who were over there in Damascus, defeated them, and then the empire went on much more religious at this point
Yeah.
than previously.
So
But
a lot
their Qibla right from Kufa on was always Mecca in Saudi Arabia, not Petra.
yeah. What was I going to ask you there? So a lot of the history of Islam really started at that point because, for example, the Sirahs and the Hadith and all of that tradition seems to have just emerged round about the Abbasid era. Would that be right to say?
Um, the Abbasids, when they arrive, they have a problem because they trying to make themselves legitimate. As I said, they had to bring somebody from the Abbas family and set him up, and so make
Okay.
him sort of the figurehead. They
Yeah.
also needed to present Islamic history. There wasn't any good histories, and so they begin to rewrite or to write, maybe rewrite, all the Islamic history in their favor. They
Okay.
have to make the Umayyads look bad.
Yeah.
And so
History is
this
written by the victors, effectively.
that's right. History is written by the victors, and the victors in this case were very busy writing history.
Yeah.
Okay, so that they could write it in their favor. So it's still history, and it's still helpful to read all the writers from the Abbasid time because they go back and do all the research. But the previous books mysteriously disappear. So you have things like Ibn Ishaq. His book is gone. We
Yeah.
do not
Yeah.
have it. We do not have a copy. Others have tried to reconstruct it, and what we have is a reconstruction of all of the times people quoted him, and they reconstruct it. Same thing happens to the Zumrud, another book from back then, and it's been lost, but people have tried to reconstruct as much as we can because the people quoted it, people argued against it, saying it says this and this, so they've tried to rebuild these
Wow.
books. because all we have is the Abbasid versions of history,
Yeah.
not the early version. So even
Interesting.
though we have that, we can still go back and find bits and pieces
Yeah.
in there. But we are working in kind of putting together a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces or a bunch of pieces are missing, and maybe a few of somebody's drawn a bit on them with a felt pen. If you've ever put a puzzle together,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
realize I'm having problem fitting this because all the pieces aren't there.
And I think this is probably what makes all of this history so fascinating for people who come into it.
Yeah.
Certainly for me, it's always been about the puzzle of what really happened.
And it's a detective story. It goes on from there because that influences they're trying to get these writers, and then they're trying to, so they're always looking back, trying to restore the glories of the previous empire, the Nabateans and so forth. And so they need to develop ways to tell how does the Qibla point to Mecca and Saudi Arabia. Hence comes along now the mathematicians. And the big project for all the mathematicians is how do you accurately determine the Qibla direction? So this is what ties in Dr. King, who's been arguing with me on some of this because he looks at the history through the eyes of the Abbasids and takes them 400%. This is the way it is because an Abbasid told me this. And I
Okay.
come
Yeah.
along and I'm like, no, let's take that with a grain of salt and let's look at this. And so we're having a clash. Because I don't take Abbasid propaganda I take it with a big grain of salt.
Yeah. Yeah.
What all they're saying, because they were trying to explain, well, this is how they did it in the past, but now we're going to use mathematics. And so we have algebra coming along, developing algebra. We have calculus coming along, geometry, because they've got to figure this out. Even the geometry around the curve of the earth and all
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
this. So the Arabs suddenly have their golden age. They
Yeah.
are translating all the books before, because remember, Europe is going into the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so they are getting all these Greek books and Latin books and translating them into Arabic. And they've got Baghdad becomes the center of it's an open city for study, and everybody goes there. The libraries are there, the books are there, the people are, and it explodes in knowledge. Very similar to today, there's a real explosion in knowledge because the internet is bringing everybody together. I can do what I'm doing today because of the internet puts me in touch with these scholars all over the world that I could never have done 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Just would have been too hard to get the correspondence going. Now we can actually throw up a paper and they get put up on the internet, and other scholars can come along, read it, and give notes and talk about it before that paper is actually published.
Amazing. Yeah.
Before this, it had to be peer reviewed by everyone. And then you would, and they would tear it all apart. And the poor guy, he doesn't have a chance to correct his errors because he's been
Oh, yeah.
sort of torn apart. It's much better now where you can publish this. People can come along and say, I don't know if I agree with that. Have you considered this or have you considered that? So the same thing was happening when I was working on the Petra Mecca thing. I was
Yeah.
in contact with 40 other scholars who very quietly were in contact with me, and I had 40 sets of eyes. And they would come. I remember one writing, have you considered the Zumrad? What's written in there? That's all he had to say. That was
Yeah.
just enough to go, oh, what's this? I hadn't heard of the Zumrad. I went to check the Zumrad, and that opened the whole area. So just
Wow.
somebody, just to touch, to say, have you heard of this? Have you done this? That is very, very powerful. And there are these quiet circles that
Yeah.
are maybe not even on the internet of people who meet each other, and they just say a few words to each other, which really, really helps. Very much appreciate it when somebody comes along and says, oh, have you read this guy's work? That's very helpful because suddenly you realize, I hadn't thought of that. And so you can go and do it. And so a lot of stuff can be actually peer reviewed before it's officially peer reviewed. Does
Yeah.
that make any sense?
Yeah. It's kind of like an iteration process, like when you develop software. It's the same sort of thing. You sort out the bugs, and eventually you release maybe the beta version, and that's like the
Right.
peer review. It's very similar.
Yeah,
Um.
and so this was happening in Baghdad.
Yeah.
Okay, you bring everybody together, and so they were no longer spread all over. And this was bringing people. And the same thing happened in Spain. A group gathered in Spain, a group gathered in Baghdad. And so Cordoba on one side, Baghdad on the other, centers of learning. people went there because all of the various schools were there. And
Yeah,
you could
yeah,
sit down and you could listen to the various teachers and schools, whatever. It was a wonderful blossoming where it was not happening in Europe because it was all fragmented by
yeah,
local lords over their little areas. The whole Roman Empire had all broken down into little groups, and
yeah,
they're all
yeah.
in competition with one another. Not a good time for new learning to come out at that time.
I know it's probably a big question, but briefly, what brought that to an end in the golden age of Islam, where there was this great intellectual flourishing, but it sort of came to an end quite suddenly?
You
Was
were
that
going to
because?
get me in trouble. I have my own idea, and I have to be careful how I say this, but in my mind, what brought it to an end was Sharia law.
Yeah,
Sharia law was not invented when the Quran came into existence. It
yeah,
was not around for the first 300 years.
yeah,
Okay, so all of this was happening without Sharia law.
yeah.
Sharia law was invented the same. The actual guy who put Sharia law together was actually thrown into jail. He died in jail
Really?
because they said it is not Islamic. But
Huh.
eventually they needed a code of law. And so
Yeah,
these schools come on. You can get into the various schools that are out there and you know, all the just burns and how it works and Hanafi and all these things.
yeah.
But as they codified Islam, and made it this is the way it has to be and built all these rules, all of this freedom of thinking and
It just
exploring and
came.
everything else
Yeah,
was squeezed over the next century or two, and suddenly it had squeezed the life out of it.
yeah, yeah,
And it came down, and this is the regimented kind of Islam then that existed for the next 1,000 years. You know, it
yeah.
just and it you don't find any of that happening again because the golden age was over. And I think it was simply because the legalization, the stratification, the you know whatever the right word is, you know, turning it into fossils. You know, this got to be this way, and you can't think. And eventually, it came to mean, and this is very strong today. Jahiliyyah means the time of ignorance. Okay, before
Yeah,
Muhammad, we don't even talk about that.
yeah,
Archaeologists who dig in Jahiliyyah do so in shame in places like Saudi Arabia and other places because they're digging in the ruins of polytheists and people before Islam.
yeah,
Okay, once Enlightenment came, oh, okay, now you can study history because you're studying Muhammad, but you don't study anything outside of it. And so it's sort of it cut the knowledge way down, and so you couldn't even today ask questions. I
yeah,
mean, a
yeah,
100 years ago, a Muslim couldn't say, "I wonder if Muhammad, you know, actually existed or not." And they gets no, you couldn't even think that
yeah,
because that was
yeah,
shirk. And so
yeah,
they were just blocked in. It's the Arab Spring that broke this through, and
yeah,
that came out of people going to university, going to the West, where they didn't teach you things, they taught you questions.
yeah, yeah.
Question everything, seek for answers everywhere.
That's what it
And
expands us,
that has
the
started
knowledge.
a
Yeah,
renaissance in Muslim countries as they're beginning. And the first thing they do is they ask questions about political leaders. It's taken a long time, and even today, I would say the majority of Muslims are very reluctant to question anything about their religion simply
yeah,
because they fear they were going to commit shirk and
yeah,
they're
yeah.
going to in some way. And that began after the golden age of Islam. That whole
Okay.
idea came in, and as it built up, it shut the whole thing down. That's where I come from, and I
Yeah,
will argue for that, but I could be wrong, and I could be seeing it in my own warped way, but
yeah.
that's how I see it personally.
Yeah, I think I would probably kind of support you in that. It looks like that to me as well. Dan, thank you very much for taking this interview. For those who would like to buy your books, where is a good place to go?
Go to thesacredcity.ca. So it's all
Okay,
one word, thesacredcity.ca. It's got books on there. It's got all the YouTube clips if you want to watch the YouTube videos and so forth.
okay. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.